Hello, my online learners, and welcome to part 2 of the heart. So we're going to continue on with the cardiac cycle, and the cardiac cycle is the movements of the heart. Please realize everything is working together, and as one thing is emptying, the other is filling. So although we talk about it one chamber at a time, realize the top chambers are working and the bottom chambers are working, and when one set of chambers is relaxing, the other one is contracting. So as I said, systole is the contraction and diastole is the relaxation. And during contraction, the blood is pushed out, and during relaxation, the chamber is filling with blood. So when you look at, let's look at this diagram here. So this is diagram 13.3 and 13-3. And again, it looks like it's really complicated, but think logically as opposed to memorizing all the steps. You want the blood to come into the heart, be collected in the atrium, go through to the ventricle, pumped out to the lungs, come back from the lungs, and be pumped to the body. And if you think of it that way, it's not quite as confusing, because all these details, I want you to logically understand it as opposed to go through all the steps. Okay, and I did put some good videos on the web page or in the Blackboard. Watch those to help you, but you do need to know your chambers and your valves. Very important. And then there's little quizzes to help you with your chambers and your valves. Okay, things to remember: that the two pumps work at the same time. So both atriums fill at the same time, both ventricles fill at the same time. And the ejection of the blood occurs at the same time. Now, when we look at the coronary circulatory system, which is the circulatory system that feeds the heart, a lot of detail in these diagrams. I just want you to realize that coronary arteries feed the heart and cardiac veins collect it up from the heart. They are this. If you're getting a bypass, this is what you're bypassing. These little vessels here are what get clogged or bust. Usually they get clogged because the heart is beating, so it's tricky for the blood to get through. Plus, the heart, these are a little delicate, very delicate. Also, because in most situations there isn't a second way to feed the cells, it is important that the heart cells get fed, because the heart is a very active muscle. When we look at the heart itself, cardiac muscle is autorhythmic, which means it contracts without any nerve impulses or hormones, but the nerve impulses and the hormones will start it and control it. Now, when you look at the parts, so there are a bunch of parts again. For the electrical system, this is controlling the organizing the contraction of the heart. You have an SA node or a sinoatrial node, and this is where the signal goes to start the contraction of the heart. Sinus means space, so this is the space atrial node, and then as the signal transfers from the SA node, it goes to the AV node, the atrioventricular node. In the atrioventricular node, the signal will then be passed down what's called the atrioventricular bundle, also called the bundle of His. Then it goes down to the very bottom and then to the Purkinje fibers on the outside. And that's when contraction starts. So the contraction of the ventricles start at what's called the apex and then push the blood out. And there's some really good videos on this, because this is really hard to describe use a diagram to describe a process. So watch the videos on the contraction of the heart. Mainly these ones, you need to know these 5 parts and the order in which they occur. Now, as there's signals going through the heart, you end up with an electrical signal, and it's normally called an ECG. It's called an EKG in some places because it was developed in Germany, and cardiac starts with a K in Germany. So that's why it's an EKG. But in Canada, we call it an ECG, electrocardiogram. And it has 3 distinct waves, and it will detect the average electrical activity on the body. So when you look at it, you have a P wave, you have a QRS complex, and you have a T wave. Some videos talk about the segments or the distances in between. If you continue on in a specialty, you may describe that in more detail. We're looking really basic here. P wave, QRS complex, T wave. In the P wave, this is where the electrical signal is going through the atrium. And that causes what is called depolarization, or it's the contraction of the atrium. Okay? Then the atrial will be relaxing at the same time as the ventricles contract. But the contracting of the ventricles is such a large stimulus that we get this big spike. So atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, ventricular relaxation. The atrium relaxes when the ventricles contract, but there's no signal for it because it's lost in the ventricle contraction. Okay, so again, this seems really complicated, but we're going to stick very basic here so you get an idea of it without going into too much detail. Excuse me. Next, blood is a connective tissue, and the reason why we have the heart is to move the blood around. You normally have about 4 to 6 liters of blood, which if you think it's a big milk jug full of blood. Blood has 3 functions. You are going to transport the nutrients and gases around. It helps regulate the pH, heat. It also regulates hormones with that. And then you have protection, and the protection is due to, there's a clotting mechanism, and you also have protection because the white blood cells will fight diseases. Transport to the lungs, nutrients from the digestive system, fat cells, hormones, salts, the return trip. The blood helps regulate a variety of levels in the body, and that includes pH, electrolyte values, and the blood regulates body temperature. Excuse me. It spreads it through the skin if it's cold, and it will release it if it's hot. The blood also can regulate your fluid balance, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the kidney, because really the kidneys will balance the blood and then put everything in the urine. So we often talk about kidneys as creating urine. Really, kidneys balance blood and as a result put things in the urine. The blood also protects from invasions and infection, and that includes the white blood cells. And then there are special white blood cells which specifically act to fight infection. So when we're looking at the composition of the blood, there is something called a hematocrit, which is this thing here. So what they do to get this little blood sample, and it's not a huge test tube, usually it's done very small. If you've ever had taken a blood sample, it's not as huge as it looks. What they do, they take it and put it in a centrifuge, and that will separate it, and it separates into plasma. And plasma is about 55% of the blood. Plasma is the major component. Oh, before we get started, there is an assignment where I want you to make a brief summary table where you're putting all the 4 components of the blood into a summary table. So you're describing what the component is, what it creates, and just briefly what the function is. So this way you've got it summarized. And again, I just want a few things in there. Okay, plasma. So the 4 parts of the blood are plasma, and then it divides into what's called formed elements. And then we don't actually call them cells because some of them aren't full cells. The red blood cell, or the erythrocyte, is no longer a true cell because one of the last functions, or blood cells are made in the white blood, in the bone marrow. One of the last steps is to put out the nucleus, so there's more room for hemoglobin. So it's not truly a cell because it doesn't have a nucleus. Also, platelets are just fragments of cells. So instead of talking about blood cells, which we talk about formed elements. It's just being technical. Okay, blood. You have your plasma. The main consistency of water, of your plasma, is water, but it also contains your electrolytes, your salts, your plasmas, your proteins, your nutrients. And when it comes to proteins, there's one called albumin, which helps in osmotic pressure. You've got fibrinogen, which we'll look at later, which is used in clotting. And you also have globulins, which is another word for antibodies. When you look at your blood cells, there are 3 different types. Erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and platelets, which are used in blood clotting. Okay, so let's go back now and have a bit of a summarization here. So the blood composition, the majority of your blood is plasma, and it is mainly water, but it's also nutrients, salts, oxygens, hormones, and other regulatory substances. The plasma proteins are very important, and they aid in water movement. You also have your clotting factors and something called fibrinogen, which is one of the last steps of a clotting factor. It's when you see this ogen, that's an inactive clotting, an inactive anything. And you want them to be there so that way they're ready to go when they're ready to go, but you need them inactive so that they don't clot when you don't want them to clot. Okay, then you've got your formed elements. Now, this textbook lists all the different types of leukocytes or white blood cells. I just want you to be aware that they are, and then later on we'll go into more detail. Good. White blood cells are created in the red bone marrow from a process called erythropoiesis. And they're similar to donut shaped, have a small life cycle. Only 120 days. Now, there are 2 critical functions for blood. So they mainly transport oxygen, and they do it at a special site called hemoglobin. And then on a lesser scale, carbon dioxide is also attached to the red blood cell, but not in a specific site. It's sort of hanging on the outside, interacting with a hydrogen. Then there are leukocytes. Leukocytes' job are to prevent invasion and to prevent infection. And they're divided into 2 groups based on whether they have granulocytes, which are these dots, or agranulocytes. So when you look at the smear of blood, here's our red blood cells. They kind of look like donuts. Here's our white cells, which stain, the nucleus of the white cells stain purple, and platelets are these little dots. And when we look at platelets, they're called thrombocytes. So you may have heard of the word thrombo in terms of clot. Thrombocytes are the ones that are clotted, and they are responsible for clotting. And we'll talk more about the clotting process in a bit. When the thrombocytes are activated, they basically stick together and they will form a hole. They will plug a hole in the blood vessel. They will release serotonin, which causes constriction and a decrease of blood flow. They will then go and activate stuff. Okay. Blood types and transfusions. You may know that there is AB, and O blood, and it has to do with this called a antigen, and an antigen is a marker. So if you have a foreign antigen, which your body sees as non-self, so you have these markers which your body recognizes as self, and then you see these ones that are non-self. The non-self ones will be attacked by antibodies, which will then glob onto them, put them out of commission, and then the white blood cells that clean things up, called macrophages, will come and clean them up. Okay? Now, a lot of detail on this. Watch the video. It's a little more detail. There is blood type O. Here it is. Blood type A has an A antigen on the surface. I'm going to run out of time, so we'll have to continue with this later. Sorry about that.